In 1792, the state of Pennsylvania paid the federal government $151,640.24 for a triangle of land it did not need to survive, and did not yet know it needed at all. 75 cents an acre. For that price, the state that had been born without a single mile of Great Lakes shoreline bought itself one harbor. Not a chain of harbors, not a coastline. One, sheltered by a curving peninsula of sand the French had already named a century earlier, Presque Isle, almost an island. By 1960, the city that grew up on that harbor held 138,440 people, the most it would ever hold, and its factories built more diesel-electric locomotives than almost any other place on Earth. Today, Erie, Pennsylvania has roughly 92,900 residents, a third fewer than at its peak, and the machines that once moved freight across a continent are built mostly somewhere else now. This is the story of what 75 cents an acre eventually bought, and what it cost to lose it. Chapter 1. The Triangle and the Harbor. Pennsylvania's charter lines were drawn by men who never saw the lake they almost touched. The colonial boundaries stopped a few miles short of Lake Erie, leaving the state landlocked against the largest inland shipping system on the continent, hemmed in by claims New York and Connecticut already held on either side of the gap. No port meant no trade with the interior, no harbor meant no fleet, and no fleet meant no way to compete with the docks already rising at Buffalo and Cleveland. So the state bought the wedge of federal land still sitting between its border and the water. A triangle, not a rectangle, its shape dictated by survey lines its neighbors had already claimed on both sides. The purchase bought exactly one usable harbor, a bay sheltered by a curving sandbar the French had already named Presque Isle. Everything Erie became depended on that one bend of sand. The French understood the value of that harbor first. On May 3, 1753, French soldiers landed at Presque Isle Bay and began cutting timber for a fort, one link in a chain meant to seal the Ohio country against the British before they could claim it. They called it Fort de la Presqu'Île, the opening move in a contest for the interior of North America that would end in a war fought on two continents. The French held it 6 years, then burned it themselves in 1759, rather than surrender it as British forces advanced. The British rebuilt on the same ground and held it 4 years more. In June 1763, during the uprising that carried Pontiac's name into the history books, native forces besieged the rebuilt fort and took its surrender. The harbor changed hands again. Pennsylvania did not send settlers to hold its harbor until 4 decades after the French had first bled for it. Andrew Ellicott was a Pennsylvania-born surveyor who had just finished laying out the streets of the nation's new capital at Washington, D.C., and in 1795, the state sent him to Presque Isle Bay to plat a town where none yet stood. Colonel Seth Reed, a Massachusetts-born settler, arrived the same year and built the first log cabin at the mouth of Mill Creek, before Ellicott's crews had finished their lines. The place did not yet hold more than a handful of families. It had a survey. It had a cabin. It did not yet have a reason for either to matter. The garrison that gave the harbor military weight arrived under a general whose reputation had preceded him for 20 years. Anthony Wayne was a Pennsylvania-born officer who had earned the name Mad Anthony for a battlefield temper his own soldiers feared, and who had broken the Western Indian Confederacy at Fallen Timbers 2 years earlier. Opening the frontier, the log cabins at Presque Isle were now filling. He arrived at the fort in December 1796, already ill, and did not complete whatever journey he had set out on. On December 15, 1796, Wayne died inside the fort's blockhouse. At his own request, he was buried beneath its floor. The frontier he had helped secure now held his body as well as his name. 13 years later, Wayne's son Isaac came to Erie to bring his father home to the family plot outside Philadelphia. What he found beneath the blockhouse floor was a body too well preserved by the cold clay to travel by wagon as it was. On a physician's advice, the body was boiled until the flesh separated from the bone, and the flesh was reburied where the coffin had stood. The bones were packed into a trunk and carried by cart across the width of Pennsylvania toward Radnor. Smaller ones were reportedly lost along the road and never recovered. Mad Anthony Wayne ended up with 2 graves 300 miles apart. Erie kept the flesh. Philadelphia got the bones. 16 years after that coffin first went into the ground at the blockhouse, in the last months of 1812, a Great Lakes mariner named Daniel Dobbins walked into the Navy Department in Washington with an idea about the same stretch of water. Chapter 2. 6 Ships in a Village. Daniel Dobbins was a Pennsylvania-born lake captain who had spent his working life running cargo on the water above Niagara. Having lost his vessel to the British that summer at the fall of Mackinac Island, he reached the Navy Department in the last months of 1812, with more to say about that harbor than any officer in the building. His pitch was simple: build the fleet at Presque Isle Bay, behind the sandbar, where no British gun could reach it without first crossing water too shallow to carry one. Dobbins argued anyway. By September, he had a contract, federal money, and orders to start cutting timber. Noah Brown, the man sent to build the fleet, arrived from New York that same winter. Brown was a New York shipwright who had built vessels along the East River for years, who measured hulls by eye and built from standing timber, not seasoned stock. He reached Presque Isle when the village around the harbor held a few hundred people, log houses, and a sawmill, nothing resembling a shipyard. The fleet, Brown decided, would be built from green timber, cut straight off the bank. It was not how a navy built ships. It was how Presque Isle would have to build them. Over the next 8 months, Brown's crews raised 6 warships from that green timber, 2 brigs of roughly 480 tons apiece, and 4 smaller schooners and gunboats. Shipwrights were scarce on the frontier, so Brown filled his crews with whoever the village could spare. Farmers who had never driven a tree nail, blacksmiths who had never forged a fitting, boys barely old enough to swing a broadaxe. They worked through a Lake Erie winter in tents pitched at the tree line. Green timber warps as it dries. The hulls would need refastening within a season if they lasted that long. Nobody at Presque Isle had the luxury of waiting for cured wood. The finished hulls faced one obstacle before they carried a gun: the sandbar at the harbor mouth. The feature that made the bay defensible sat too shallow for the 2 big brigs to clear it loaded. Brown answered it with wooden camels. Buoyant boxes floated against each hull, flooded, sealed, then pumped dry, lifting the ship between them clear of the bar. By early August 1813, the fleet, built from green timber and floated over a sandbar and wooden boxes, was riding open water. On September 10, 1813, Perry's fleet met the British squadron, and for more than 2 hours, the fighting fell almost entirely on one ship. His flagship, the Lawrence, took the concentrated fire of the British line at close range, and by the time she could no longer answer it, casualties among her crew were reported as high as 4 in every 5 men killed or wounded. With the Lawrence unable to fight, Perry had one option left, and reaching it meant crossing open water swept by British guns. He left the wrecked Lawrence in an open boat and rowed roughly half a mile under fire to the brig Niagara. The hull Brown's camels had floated over the sandbar months before. He carried a blue battle flag sewn in Erie by Margaret Forster Stewart, lettered with the dying words of Captain James Lawrence: "Don't give up the ship." From the Niagara's deck he broke the British line, and within hours the entire squadron had surrendered. His report to General William Henry Harrison that afternoon ran to a single sentence that would outlast every ship built at Presque Isle: "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." The war ended a little more than a year later, and the fleet built in one desperate winter never fired another shot. What Presque Isle Bay had proved was that a harbor barely large enough for a village could still decide who controlled a lake. Erie had a battle it would be remembered for. It did not yet have a way to get a barrel of salt or a ton of coal down to the water's edge. Chapter 3. The Peanut War. The canal answered a question the war had left unresolved. Ground was broken on the Erie Extension Canal in 1831, cut south from the harbor toward the Ohio River system through swamp, shale, and the stubborn rock of the watershed divide. 13 years passed before the last lock closed and the last towpath was graded. In 1844, the canal opened end to end, and coal, iron, and grain began moving through Erie's harbor in volumes the fur trade and the fishing skiffs had never approached. Canal boats loaded at the harbor moved south behind mule teams on the towpath, and boats loaded on the Ohio River system moved north to meet them, closing a gap that had taken 13 years and one purchased triangle of land to open. The village that had built 6 warships in a single winter now had a reason to build warehouses instead. Erie had its harbor and its battle behind it. It finally had its trade. That trade sat on a fault line nobody had drawn on purpose. The railroads reaching Erie from the east ran on one gauge. The railroads reaching Erie from the west, out of Ohio, ran on another. Between the two networks sat exactly one city where the rails did not match, Erie. It forced every locomotive arriving from either direction to stop at the city line. It forced every passenger to climb down and cross the platform to a different train. It forced every ton of coal, grain, and machinery to be unloaded, carted, and reloaded onto cars built for the other gauge. By 1853, hotels, warehouses, draymen, and porters were all paid by that mismatch. The gauge was not a flaw in Erie's economy. It was the engine of it. Alfred King held the office of mayor of Erie when the railroads finally moved to close that gap. New track meant to run one gauge straight through downtown, ending the changeover trade in a single season. King swore in 150 special constables on December 7, 1853, and did not send them out alone. He led them himself, on foot, to the bridges the railroads had built over state and French streets, and ordered the bridges torn down, plank by plank. A mayor tearing down a chartered railroad's bridges was not a metaphor for resistance. It was the resistance, carried out with crowbars, by the one official in the city whose job was supposedly to keep order. 20 days later, the fight moved to Harbor Creek, where a crowd was tearing up track by hand. A railroad official arrived, and rather than negotiate, fired directly into the men doing the work. The crowd did not scatter. It stormed the train that had carried him. The locomotive fled the only direction still open to it, running in reverse at full speed for the Ohio state line rather than risk stopping again inside Pennsylvania. A train built to run forward outran an armed mob by refusing to face it. Erie had won that skirmish. It had not won the war. Newspapers outside Erie had a name for the whole conflict, and it was not a flattering one. They called it the Peanut War, a fight waged by a lunch-stop city to stay relevant enough that trains still had to stop long enough to eat. It was the kind of name a war earns when the prize is a sandwich and a change of platform rather than a coastline. On February 1st, 1854, the gauges were unified end to end, and the first through train crossed Erie without slowing down. No constables met it at the city line. No bridges stood in its way. Erie had lost the argument it had fought in the streets for more than a year, and the hotels, the draymen, and the porters lost their trade along with it. If the trains would no longer stop in Erie, Erie would have to build something worth carrying instead. Chapter 4. The Engine City and the Broken Aqueduct. Erie did not wait to see whether the railroads would let it keep the changeover trade. In 1840, Before the canal had even reached the Ohio River system, a foundry went up on the flats near the harbor under the name Presque Isle Foundry, casting stove parts and machine fittings for a lake port still finding its footing. In 1851, the operation took a new name, Erie City Iron Works, and with it, a new ambition. Boilers and stationary steam engines, cast and assembled on the lakeshore for customers the city would never meet. Boilers went out by canal boat. Boilers went out by rail car. Boilers went out to mills and mines 1,000 miles from the harbor that made them. By 1884, more than a dozen specialized foundries and machine shops were casting iron within the city limits. And by the early 1900s, Erie was building more engines and boilers than any other city in the country. Enough that the city gave itself a name to match the output, the boiler and engine capital of the world. The canal that had made all of it possible to move was, by then, already 13 years dead. In September of 1871, the wooden aqueduct that carried the canal 100 feet above the Elk Creek Gorge, 500 feet of timber trestle, the single structure on which the entire southern run of the waterway depended, gave way and dropped into the ravine below. No fire accompanied it. No count of the dead followed it. It was a structure failing under its own age and its own span, the way wooden things built to hold water above a gorge eventually do. The canal it served had taken 13 years to dig, lock by lock, out of swamp and shale. It did not take 13 years to abandon. By 1872, less than a year after the aqueduct fell, the waterway was closed for good, and its towpaths were left to the weeds that still line the route today. The railroads Erie had fought in the streets less than 20 years earlier inherited what the canal left behind, and they did not have to fire a shot to get it. The city that had torn down bridges to protect a mismatched gauge now shipped its boilers and its engines on the very rails it had once ripped from the ground. The future, as it turned out, had steel wheels, and Erie had already built the foundries to feed it. The harbor did not go quiet just because the canal had. In 1892, 13 million pounds of fish were landed at Erie in a single year, pulled from a lake that had already carried Perry's fleet and the canal's coal barges and now fed a fishing trade of its own. By the 1920s, the city ranked among the largest freshwater fishing ports in the world. The harbor that Pennsylvania had bought for 75 cents an acre was still paying for itself in ways that had nothing to do with locomotives or boilers. In 1898, three brothers built something else on that same lakeshore. Ernst, Otto, and Bernhard Behrendt were German-born papermakers whose father, Moritz Behrendt, had once run a mill called the Hammermill in Prussia, supplying paper to the government of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. The sons carried the family trade across the Atlantic and set it down on the shore of Presque Isle Bay, Americanizing the old mill's name into something a lake port could pronounce, Hammermill. A foundry city that already cast boilers for the world now had a paper mill built by men whose father had once served a chancellor. Erie kept collecting trades it had never asked for. 36 years after the aqueduct dropped into Elk Creek Gorge, a single sentence would be set into type in a local newspaper on a summer morning in 1907 about a company that had not yet built so much as a foundation in the city. Nobody setting that type that day knew the sentence would still be read a century later. Chapter 5. The Certainty at Lawrence Park. On the morning of August 7, 1907, the Erie Daily Times set 9 words into type that read less like a news item than a prophecy. General Electric will come to Erie for a certainty. The company had not signed a contract. The company had not broken ground. The company had not so much as filed a deed. It had only sent a man to look, and Erie had already decided how the story would end. The man was Francis Pratt, a General Electric scout dispatched to find ground for a new plant somewhere along the industrial corridor of the Great Lakes. What steered him to Erie, rather than to a dozen competing lake towns, was not a survey report. It was a classmate. Matthew Griswold Jr., a local manufacturer who had sat beside Pratt at Yale years earlier, made the case in person. Cheap land, a natural harbor already proven by a century of shipping, and rail lines from 3 directions converging on the same flats. Pratt looked, and the Times, for once, had not exaggerated. General Electric bought roughly 800 acres east of the city on open farmland at a place called Lawrence Park, and began laying the foundation for what would grow into one of the largest locomotive plants on Earth. 800 acres was a small city's worth of ground, purchased before a single structural beam had been ordered, on the strength of a scout's report and a classmate's sales pitch. The foundry's downtown had spent 60 years earning Erie the title of boiler and engine capital of the world. General Electric arrived and simply asked for more room than the whole downtown industrial district occupied. That same year, a smaller enterprise organized a few miles away, with far less fanfare. The Heisler Locomotive Works set up on West 16th Street in 1907, building geared steam locomotives designed for the steep, uneven grades of American lumber camps. Machines built not for main lines but for logging spurs cut through timber too rough for anything else. By 1941, the works had turned out roughly 625 of them. Erie now had 2 locomotive builders inside its limits in the same year, one of them backed by the largest electrical manufacturer in the country, the other supplying a single specialized trade to sawmill towns most Americans never named. General Electric did not intend to house its workforce the way the foundries had, in whatever row houses happened to be standing nearby. It hired John Nolan, already a celebrated planner of American company towns, to lay out Lawrence Park as a garden city built around the plant rather than crowded against it. Streets curved instead of gridding. Lots held yards. Nolan named the avenues for the scientists whose work the plant's own engineers depended on: Rankine, Silliman, Smithson, Morse. A locomotive works that ran on castings, and Current now had a neighborhood that read like a physics syllabus. The plan held until the war made it too small. Rows of brickworker housing went up in 1917 to absorb the wartime surge in hiring, plain and fast, where Nolan's original streets had been deliberate. Lawrence Park kept growing around the plant regardless of who had drawn the lines, and in February 1926, the township incorporated on its own, no longer a company annex, but a governed place with its own name on the map. The plant in those first years made castings and stationary gas engines, the same kind of work Erie's foundries had been doing since 1840, only bigger. Its real calling was still 5 years off, waiting on the rails that already ran past its door. Chapter 6: The Clock and the Marquee. In 1912, the plant at Lawrence Park shipped its first locomotive out of the yard, a small electric switcher built for the short, punishing shunting work that never made a headline. The scale meant nothing to a city already used to boilers by the thousand. What mattered was that the plant, after 5 years casting stationary gas engines, had finally found the one product it would be known for. General Electric had bought 800 acres for a locomotive works. In 1912, it finally built one. 2 world wars asked the same buildings to do more than one job at once, and they did. It built artillery shells through one war. It built ship turbines through both. It built locomotives straight through the middle of all of it, without pause, as though pausing were the one thing the plant had never learned how to do. The machinists who cast a howitzer shell on a Tuesday could be assembling a locomotive traction motor on a Wednesday, same floor, same cranes, a different order sheet. In 1940, General Electric partnered with the American Locomotive Company, ALCO, pairing GE's electrical equipment with ALCO's mechanical frames to build mainline diesel-electric locomotives. By the late 1940s, the company claimed that 4 out of every 5 diesel-electric locomotives running on American rails carried GE electrical equipment somewhere inside them. The plant east of the harbor had become, in a single decade, the electrical heart of an industry it had entered 28 years earlier with one small switcher. Downtown, the money the plant was generating had somewhere to go, and in 1929 it went into 6 stories on State Street. The Boston store's new building rose 145 feet wide, anchored by a clock tower 40 feet tall, readable from blocks in either direction. "Meet me under the clock" became the kind of phrase that needed no address attached to it, understood by every family in Erie, the way a street number is understood by nobody outside it. On April 10, 1931, Warner Brothers opened the Warner Theater 2 blocks away, built for $1.5 million in the same years that were closing banks across Pennsylvania by the dozen. Its marquee weighed 10 tons and carried more than 8,000 colored bulbs, wired to burn every night regardless of the week's deposit numbers at the banks still open. The architects were Rapp and Rapp of Chicago, the firm already responsible for the movie palaces rising in Buffalo and Manhattan. A few blocks north, in 1925, a quiet office opened under the name of its founder, H.O. Hurt, selling automobile insurance to a city rapidly filling itself with automobiles. Nobody meeting under the clock that year had reason to notice it. Picture State Street on a Thursday evening in 1936. The Boston store's clock tower is lit gold above the sidewalk, and the Warner marquee 3 blocks south throws its 8,000 bulbs onto wet pavement left by an afternoon rain. Streetcars run the center line every few minutes, bells cutting under the crowd noise at closing time for the shift at Lawrence Park. Automobiles nose for parking along both curbs, more of them every year now that Hertz office is writing policies on half of them. A block that had been foundry runoff 40 years earlier now spends $1.5 million lighting one doorway. The theater went up in the same 4 years that closed a quarter of Pennsylvania's banks, and nobody buying a ticket that night seemed to be doing the arithmetic. In 1953, General Electric took over the gas turbine locomotive program and built, for the Union Pacific Railroad, the most powerful locomotives ever put on rails. It then launched its own line of road diesels, engines that would outproduce nearly everything Alco had once brought to the partnership. Locomotives assembled at Erie were by then pulling freight on every continent except Antarctica. The plant that had shipped one small switcher in 1912 now had its name on rails it would never see, in countries most of its machinists would never visit. The city built around all of it kept climbing, decade after decade, toward a population it had never carried before and would never carry again, a number the next census would finally set down in full. Chapter 7. The High Water Mark. The number came in at 138,440. That was the population the 1960 census recorded for Erie, the largest the city had held at any point before, and the largest it would ever hold again. Though nobody counting heads that spring had reason to suspect a ceiling had just been reached. The Erie Works alone was reported to carry between 15,000 and 20,000 workers on its payroll at the height of that decade. The estimates vary, and whichever figure was closer to true, the arithmetic of the city ran through it regardless. 4 out of every 5 livelihoods in Erie traced back, in one line or another, to manufacturing. A foundry job, a machine shop contract, a rail spur, a paycheck spent at a downtown counter that existed only because someone upstream had built something first, sold it, and shipped it out again. What Erie built in those years filled boxcars headed in every direction the rail lines ran. It built boilers. It built paper on hammer mills' rolling machines and plastics in the newer plants beside them. It built gas meters and malleable iron castings, sterilizers bound for hospitals 2 states away, and out at Lawrence Park, the locomotives that had carried the name since before the war. A single mid-sized city on a lakeshore no wider than a few miles was, at that moment, quietly responsible for shipping all of it outward at once. Boilers, paper, plastics, meters, iron, sterilizers, locomotives. a catalog that read less like the output of one city than of a small industrial nation. Downtown kept pace with the plants, so did the neighborhoods ringing them, filled now with second and third generation families who had never worked anywhere but a foundry floor. State Street stores stayed lit past dark. The clock outside the department store kept the hour for shoppers who had somewhere to be, and the 4 and 5 who owed their week to a factory paycheck spent a good part of it there, unhurried, certain the arrangement would hold for a long while yet. Then the numbers turned, without any particular occasion marking the moment. The 1970 census, taken only 10 years after the one that had set the record, showed Erie smaller than it had been, down by more than 9,000 people, the first such decline the city's count had ever registered in its history. No single week explained it. No single closure explained it. No single family's decision to leave explained it either. It simply arrived the way a tide arrives, already partway in by the time anyone thought to measure it. The layoffs came in a wave in 1976, the first of a size the Erie Works had not absorbed before, and they did not resolve into anything as clean as an ending. Men were cut, then recalled, then cut again, the plant's headcount rising and falling on a schedule that had less to do with any one worker's performance than with orders placed and canceled 1,000 miles from Erie. The cycle repeated through the back half of the decade and into the next, each recall a little smaller than the layoff that had preceded it, so that the workforce thinned further every time the two evened out. A slow arithmetic nobody was asked to approve, and nobody could vote against. By the early 1980s, General Electric closed the foundry outright and moved diesel engine assembly to a non-union plant in Grove City, 75 miles south, a distance close enough to visit on a Sunday and far enough to matter every other day of the week. The work had not left Pennsylvania. It had simply stopped being Erie's. Downtown kept its lights on a little longer than the plant did. The clock on State Street still kept the hour, for now. Chapter 8. The Clock Goes Dark. On July 7, 1979, the Boston store closed. The building on State Street had stood since 1929, 145 feet wide, its 40-foot clock tower keeping the hour through 5 decades of shift changes at Lawrence Park and courtships arranged under its face. What closed it was not fire, and not bankruptcy in any dramatic sense. It was a mall, the new Mill Creek Mall. Built out in the township where the parking was free and the customers had already moved. The store could not answer that math. It shut its doors, and the clock kept ticking above 6 floors with nothing left inside them. The building where generations of Erie families had arranged to meet under that clock went dark, and it stayed dark for the next 10 years. The windows above the sidewalk blank, the clock face still turning above a floor, with nobody left to keep an appointment on it. Downtown followed the same arithmetic storefront by storefront. The shoe store, then the furniture store, then the lunch counter, retail draining out of the city the way the middle class had already drained out of it, toward the township, toward the mall, toward the driveways instead of the sidewalks. The company town did not end all at once. It ended company by company across 2 decades, in a sequence Erie's remaining foundry families could see coming a year in advance. Zurn Industries ended its Erie manufacturing in 1994 and, before the decade was out, moved its corporate headquarters to Milwaukee entirely. Lord Corporation, founded in Erie in 1924, moved its world headquarters to North Carolina in the mid-1990s. Erie Malleable Iron closed in the summer of 2001, ending 220 jobs. American Sterilizer's corporate successor, Steris, shifted production to Mexico in 2006, and by 2011, the last 240 Erie jobs on its books had followed the work to Ohio. Zurn left for Milwaukee, Lord left for North Carolina, Steris left for Ohio by way of Mexico. Erie kept losing the same argument to a different city every few years, And every time, the number of jobs lost was smaller than the last because there were fewer jobs left to lose. The mill on the lakeshore held out longer than any of them. Hammermill had been sold to International Paper in 1986. And for 16 years afterward, it went on making paper the way it had since three brothers, whose father had once run a paper mill in Prussia for a chancellor, first raised the buildings there in 1898. Then, on May 17, 2002, the mill shut down after 104 years of continuous production. On the last day, with the machines stopped and the floor already quiet, a worker walked out among the idle rollers and played taps. More than 750 jobs went with the building. Jobs that had outlasted 2 world wars, outlasted the Depression that built the Warner Theater 3 blocks from the dark clock, outlasted a full century under the same name on the gate. What the mill did not outlast was 2002. By then, the arithmetic of the whole city had turned in on itself. The foundries were gone or leaving. The clock still worked. The building beneath it would eventually fill again, though with different tenants doing different work, and Erie's 4 out of 5 stopped meaning what it had meant in 1960. What remained east of the city at Lawrence Park was the one name on the list that had not yet closed a door, moved a headquarters, or played taps over anything: General Electric, still building locomotives on the same 800 acres it had bought in 1907. That name, too, was about to make an announcement of its own. Chapter 9. The Certainty Ends. In May of 2011, General Electric made the announcement Lawrence Park had been waiting on. The company would build a second locomotive plant, this one in Fort Worth, Texas, a $200 million investment in a state where no union held a seat at the table GE's Erie workforce had spent a century building. GE's own language framed it precisely. The new plant would complement Erie, not replace it. Complement was the word issued to the press. Complement was the word repeated to the Union Hall. Complement was the word printed under photographs of groundbreaking shovels turning Tarrant County soil that spring. 17 months later, in October 2012, GE Transportation moved its headquarters out of Erie entirely, into a leased tower in downtown Chicago. The move came with no groundbreaking and no shovel. It happened the way headquarters moves usually happen when the company doing the moving would rather not draw attention to it. When a sofrans minchen out, a change of address, a line in a corporate filing, executives relocating to offices near the Chicago River, while the plant that had carried the GE name on its buildings for a century kept running without them, still building the product, still shipping the invoices, no longer setting the terms. Erie had built locomotives under that name since 1912. It had never, in all that time, housed the people who decided what got built there. The layoffs came 6 months after that. In April 2013, GE announced more than 1,000 job cuts at Erie, out of a workforce that by then numbered 5,500. A plant that had once carried 15,000 to 20,000 names on its payroll, shedding close to a fifth of what remained in a single stroke. The reasoning GE offered was the reasoning every departing employer in Erie had offered for 30 years: market conditions, freight demand, the cost of doing business in a union town. Fort Worth's growing payroll did not appear in the same sentence. It did not need to. Then, for 4 years, nothing further was announced. On July 27, 2017, General Electric announced that all locomotive production, the complete line, would leave Erie for Fort Worth. The plant Fort Worth had once been built only to complement was now the plant Erie's own work was moving to, machine by machine, contract by contract. 4 months later, in November 2017, GE announced something larger. It was not simply relocating the work. It was selling the division that made it, 110 years of castings and switchers and road diesels reduced to a line item on a balance sheet. The buyer surfaced the following spring. In May 2018, GE Transportation agreed to merge into Westinghouse Air Brake Technologies, Wabtec, in a deal that valued the business at $11.1 billion. Wabtec traced its own roots to Wilmerding, Pennsylvania, a rail supply company built in the same state, on the same industry that GE was now leaving. The transaction closed on February 25, 2019, and with it went the last piece of paper that still tied the plant at Lawrence Park to the company that built it. 112 years after the Erie Daily Times set 9 words into type, promising that General Electric would come to Erie, for a certainty, General Electric was gone. Not moved, not restructured, gone. Sold whole. Its name coming off the gate at Lawrence Park for the first time since 1907. The morning after the deal closed, before full light over Lawrence Park, workers were already moving toward the plant gates in numbers larger than an ordinary shift change. Coats zipped against the February cold, lunch pails swinging, breath showing in the air, men and women who had spent careers under a name that no longer owned the building they were walking toward. The parking lots filling faster than the morning whistle usually called for. Chapter 10. The Accident of Geography. By the time the sun cleared the roofs of Lawrence Park that morning, the crowd moving toward the gates had already worked out what the deal meant. On February 26, 2019, one day after Wabtec completed its takeover of the plant, roughly 1,700 members of UE Locals 506 and 618 walked out. The company was proposing a 2-tier wage scale that would pay new hires up to 38% less than the workers already standing beside them on the same floor. The strike lasted 9 days, the largest American manufacturing walkout in 3 years, and it ended with the old contract temporarily restored. 4 years later, the workers walked out again. From June 22nd to August 31st, 2023, a second strike ran 70 days, the longest in the plant's history, while the Erie County executive told reporters publicly that Wabtec might be preparing to close the plant for good this time. Not relocate it the way General Electric had. Not sell it the way General Electric had. Close it. It did not close. Today, the plant that once carried 15,000 names or more on its payroll employs roughly 2,200 people in Erie County, still building and rebuilding locomotives under a name that is not General Electric's. The city around it holds close to 92,900 residents, a third fewer than its 1960 peak of 138,440. The poverty rate stands at about 22.7%. The median household income is roughly $47,700, far below the county surrounding it. The Redevelopment Authority counts roughly 6,000 vacant or near worthless properties inside a city that was built, block by block, street by street, for $140,000 by block, street by street, for 140,000 residents who no longer live there. Into those emptied neighborhoods came people the factories had never employed and never would. Between 2004 and 2014, Erie resettled 4,751 refugees from 31 countries. A Bhutanese community of roughly 4,500 people took root on the city's east side, alongside Iraqi, Somali, and Syrian families, filling houses the mills had left standing empty for a decade or more. Researchers at Penn State Behrend later credited immigrants with contributing about $253 million a year to the county economy, even as federal refugee admissions were cut to a fraction of what they had once been. The city that manufacturing had abandoned was, in part, repopulated by people manufacturing had never touched at all. Downtown carried its own counterweight. The quiet office H.O. Hurt had opened in 1925. The one nobody meeting under the Boston store clock that year had reason to notice is now Erie Insurance, a Fortune 500 company with more than 3,400 employees still working downtown, the largest private employer left in the city center. Since 2017, the Erie Downtown Development Corporation has committed more than $100 million to the blocks around State Street. The restored Warner Theater has completed a $27 million final phase, its 10-ton marquee lit again above a sidewalk that spent a decade dark. Presque Isle draws more than 4 million visitors a year, the most visited state park in Pennsylvania. And Erie County has voted for the winner of every presidential election since 2008, a bellwether the rest of the country now checks on its way to bed. At Dobbins Landing, the Bicentennial Tower rises 187 feet over the bay where Perry's green timber fleet was launched in a single desperate winter. The rebuilt brig Niagara still sets sail from the Maritime Museum a few hundred yards from where Noah Brown's camels floated the original hull over the sandbar. The Boston store clock still keeps time above State Street, over apartments now instead of counters. East of the city, the Erie Works still stretches along the lake plain, a fraction of its floor space lit at any given hour. Freight locomotives idling on the test track under a sky that no longer answers to General Electric or to Wabtec's promises either. Beyond the plant, the sand of Presque Isle keeps curling into the lake, the same accident of geography the state paid $151,640.24 for in 1792, a barrier no engineer designed and no company has ever owned. It shelters the harbor whether the ships come or not. The tower stands over it at 187 feet. The brig sails past it into open water. The sand keeps curling into the lake.